Okay. So am I on?
You're live.
Oh, it's Deborah. Wait, it's Frank. Hi everyone, this is Christina Bain from Babson College. We're going to be starting shortly, so we're just getting everyone logged on who needs to be logged on. So in about 2 minutes we're going to be starting. So just stand by. Thank you for your patience. so sorry for the delay. We're just waiting to get someone online. I just want to confirm, is Frank Delmonico online? Dr. Delmonico, are you there? Okay. We'll be starting shortly. I apologize for the delay. Okay, unmute. Unmute. Good morning, good evening, everyone. Good afternoon. I apologize for the delay. This is Christina Bain at Babson College. We're having some technical challenges this morning, but we have worked through them and we are good to go. So I want to welcome all of you. We're broadcasting from Babson College. This is our final webinar in our academic year regarding looking at emerging human trafficking issues and the private sector response. The title of our webinar today and our conversation is The Price of Life, Responding to the Global Black Market in Illicit Organs. And I'm so thrilled to be co-sponsoring this with the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, the Terrorism, Transnational Crime and Corruption Center, or TRAC, and also sponsored by our wonderful supporters, McKenna Long Aldrich, LLP, soon to be combined with Denton's US for a really exciting merger of a new global law firm. So with that, I'm going to give you a sense of how we've constructed this webinar and also tell you a little bit about the program at Babson, and then I'm going to turn it over to the Global Initiative to tell us about their program. And also, then we'll get into our conversation. So this conversations that we've been having for the past year, we really wanted to put a highlight on new and emerging conversation around human trafficking and modern slavery, and we developed this series that we've been so excited to co-sponsor to really get a sense of what is happening in terms of public policy, the NGO community, and new responses to human trafficking, and more specifically, what is happening with the private sector. And we focused on a number of topics, and this webinar is the final in our series and a subject that I'm very passionate about. I was working on this when I was at the Harvard Kennedy School and looking at organ trafficking and how also organ trafficking fits within a human trafficking framework, and we're going to be talking about that today. So what I want to first do is thank our sponsors, McKenna, Long, and Aldrich, which are now merging with Denton's U.S., and this merger has been approved by partners of both firms, and this new U.S. firms bring clients inside the U.S. unrivaled access to markets around the world, and international clients increase strength in reaching across the U.S. So for more information, you'll see the website listed down at the slide, down at the bottom of the slide. And we just want to thank them. They're an amazing partner in this work, and they're doing incredible pro bono work helping victims of human trafficking here in the United States. And they're partnered with a number of community-based organizations, and we're just so thrilled to have them as our sponsors. So thank you, McKenna, Long, and Aldrich, and especially Megan McCamey and Jessica Abrahams. We couldn't do this without you. So with that, I now want to also thank the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center at George Mason University, and Dr. Louise Shelley, who's my partner in a number of activities, specifically with an initiative at the World Economic Forum. We're so grateful to you for your support, and this is their website to find more information. So to tell you a bit about the program at Babson, that is a newer program for the Babson community and the global community in our alumni network, it's called the Initiative on Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery. And we're bringing together the most entrepreneurial minds, students and business leaders, corporate, NGO, and governmental partners, and human trafficking and modern slavery activists from around the globe in order to learn, network, and build innovative approaches to advancing human freedom. So we're specifically looking at how we can train the next generation of anti-trafficking leaders in looking at human trafficking, and whether you become the CEO of Coca-Cola, whether you form your own NGO, whether you go into consulting, you leave Babson College and the experience of Babson and entrepreneurial thought and action, which is our patented teaching method, in terms of looking at this issue of modern-day slavery. And what we also want to do is leverage expertise and resources from the college to develop cutting-edge research, classroom approaches, and action-oriented initiatives, again, to educate and activate current and next-generation business leaders in the fight against human trafficking and modern slavery. So we're developing a full-fledged academic program looking at research, fellowships, student activities, including a robust regional student group in the Boston area to really catalyze thinking about how entrepreneurship and the private sector can really impact human trafficking. So now I want to introduce my wonderful colleague, Livia Wagner, who's the private sector advisor for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Livia, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Christina, for introducing us, and I'm very happy to be part of this. Well, unfortunately, now it's the last webinar of this series, but I'm sure that we're going to continue. As Christina was saying, my name is Livia Wagner, and I'm working as a private sector advisor for the Global Initiative, and I'm happy to give you a very brief introduction to what we are and what we do. The Global Initiative is a network of experts from different backgrounds, like law enforcement, development and governmental institutions, seeking for new and innovative responses to tackle organized crime. And the Global Initiative was conceived after a series of closed forum discussions with many experts from all these different organizations, which was in 2011 and 2012, as there was a need for a network of experts with different backgrounds and different hats, let's say also, to be able to develop a more strategic approach to counter organized crime. And in these discussions, the participants concluded that organized crime, and here, of course, also human trafficking falls under, is not systematically integrated in national action plans. And there is a lack of multilateral cooperation, and there is a need for a proactive global approach. So a network of experts allows a critical debate, which also and serves as an incubator for innovative strategies. And the global initiative was formally launched in 2013, and now we have a network of more than 100 independent experts from all over the world. We're trying to have a regional balance and also having a great diversity on the different topics. We're based in Geneva, and we have mainly 3 priority crimes, which one is environmental crime, cybercrime, and in general organized crime, where we have the human trafficking topic. Very often in developing and in developed countries, government authorities are struggling to effectively counter human trafficking, and there is an urgency for developing collaborative approaches. So we have started our human trafficking activities, and one of the first one was that the GI did a research report on smuggling of migrants from Africa to Europe. You can go to our website. There you find all the different reports, not only from the Global Initiative, but also from other partner organizations. And we also did a special brief for the IGAD on human trafficking. And as I was saying before, the Global Initiative is very much aware of the importance of engaging the different experts and the different stakeholders. And we are also very much looking forward to always include the private sector, as we think that the private sector is a key stakeholder in the group of stakeholders in trying to counter human trafficking. So I'm very happy for this very exciting topic today, and thank you for being with us.
Am I on? Okay. Thank you so much, Livia, for your work and partnership, and we do hope we're in conversation about continuing this webinar series possibly next year. So stay tuned for more information. And now I'm going to be introducing our moderator, but before I do, I also just want to give a thanks to my amazing colleagues here at Babson. Josh, who is here with me today in the video room, and John Florendo and Ali Schiffer, and a few others who have been along the way to help put the technical resources together so we can put on these webinars. You all are tireless in terms of helping us, and thank you for your work on these webinars and partnership. So now I want to introduce Dr. Laura Gomez-Mira, who is going to be moderating our conversation today. We're so excited to have her as our moderator, and she is an associate professor of political science at the University of Miami. Josh, can I have the presenter? Because I don't think they can see the bio slide. Okay, thank you. We're just getting the slide up. She holds a doctorate from Oxford University and a master's from the London School of Economics. She has held research fellowships at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. and at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at Notre Dame University. And she has worked as a consultant for the World Bank and the UN Development Program. Her current research project focuses on the politics of international cooperation in the fight against human trafficking. And she's really looking at comparatively at the issues of sex labor and organ trafficking in these different intersections, and again, we're so happy to have her here today. So Dr. Gomez-Mira, the floor is yours.
Hi, Christina. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very impressed with all the panelists. And I just wanted to give a few introductory remarks as a framework to what we will be hearing This is a very important and central contemporary topic, even though most people associate human trafficking with sexual exploitation and forced labor. The UN Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons, which was adopted in the year 2000 by the UN as a supplement to the Transnational Organized Crime Convention, and is the main legal instrument in the fight against human trafficking, includes removal of organs or trafficking for the removal of organs among the forms of exploitation it prohibits. And despite recent or limited attention to this issue of trafficking for organ removal and the associated crime of trafficking in human organs, these are actually becoming widespread practices. According to WHO estimates, as some of our speakers will confirm, almost 10% of transplants nowadays rely on illicitly purchased organs. Increasingly, we see patients from developed countries traveling to lower income countries that don't have laws banning organ trafficking, or that do have laws, but these are poorly enforced, to perform this type of commercial transplants. And this is becoming a very profitable illicit business. As our panelists will explain, there is much overlap between the two concepts or two illicit activities of trafficking of persons for the removal of organs and trafficking organs. And in some cases, it is in fact quite hard to distinguish between the two. But it is very clear that both practices constitute very severe human rights violations. And another very important feature that they both share is the collaboration of the private sector. And in fact, the private sector has a very important role to play. It plays a role in facilitating this type of activities, and so in that sense, the private sector is a key partner to fight and prevent this type of practice. And this includes hospitals, health clinics, but also the travel agents and other intermediaries that broker this type of transplant tourism activities. So today we're going to hear about experts and people who have a lot of experience in this field. And apart from talking and discussing the ways in which these activities happen, they will talk about national and international laws to address these issues, and some very interesting recent developments, like the signing of the first binding legal instrument, the convention, the Council of Europe Convention on Organ Trafficking, and other multi-stakeholder initiatives such as the Istanbul Declaration. So I'm going to start introducing our first two presenters. Dr. Francis Delmonico, who's a very distinguished professor of surgery at Harvard Medical School and an emeritus director of the renal transplantation at the Massachusetts General Hospital. He's immediate past president of the Transplantation Society and an advisor to the World Health Organization in matters of organ donation and transplantation since 2006. He's also the executive director of the Declaration of Istanbul Custodial Group. And Dr. Delmonico is also actually the medical director of the New England Organ Bank since 1995. He's going to be co-presenting with Dr. Rudolf Garcia-Gallont, who's a leading figure in the field of vascular surgery and organ transplantation in Guatemala. Dr. Garcia-Gallont performed the first pediatric kidney transplant in Guatemala in 1988 and the first cadaveric transplant in 1995. He's a senior staff at the Department of Surgery of the Ruralde Hospital in Guatemala and the General Hospital and Roosevelt Hospital, also in Guatemala. And he's also the Guatemala representative to the IVERIC Latin American Council for Organ Donation and Transplantation. So, Dr. Delmonico and Garcia-Gallont, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laura. It's a pleasure to be, and in fact, we're honored to be on this webinar. My remarks, I wish to address a bit of background regarding the Declaration of Istanbul. Your comment, Laura, about the private sector hospitals, which I think must be emphasized in the webinar, and then the distinguishing piece of what is trafficking in the human person for the removal of organ in contrasting to what is the trafficking of the human organ. The Declaration of Istanbul was developed in 2008 as a response of professional organizations to a request by the World Health Organization that professionals become engaged in the issue of organ trafficking. And so organ trafficking, transplant commercialism, transplant tourism is defined in that declaration as a practice that is unethical and should be prohibited throughout the world. It was a resolve of professional organizations, the Transplantation Society and the International Society of Nephrology, and it was then endorsed by more than 125 professional organizations around the world to support the alliance of this Istanbul work with the World Health Organization in combating organ trafficking. Your point, Laura, about the private sector is apt. These practices are occurring in private sector hospitals, and Dr. Garcia-Gallont will make that important piece of our conversation. It's occurring in the private hospitals that are not regulated by ministries of health. So, for example, in India, there's quite a distinction between the private sector and the public health hospitals that perform transplants, and ministries have not had the regulatory authority. In contrast, in the United States, for example, or in Europe, organ donation and transplantation has the oversight of government, of ministries of health, of federal agencies, of national agencies, because it involves more than just the practice of medicine. It involves the resource of the organ donor, whether it be living and the safety and well-being of that living donor, or the deceased as a national resource from which organs are recovered and transplanted. And in the U.S., that authority extends to both living donor and deceased donor, but importantly, it extends to every hospital performing transplants. In contrast, in Latin America, as Dr. Garcia-Gallont will point out, but very consequentially, in other parts of the world, the private sector is unregulated, and it can do as it wishes in terms of brokering transplants, patients coming from foreign destinations with bought donors that have been exploited and victimized. And then my final comment as we get into the webinar: what is the difference between the trafficking in the human person for the removal of organ and the more recent Council of Europe Convention against organ trafficking? It has to do with the action, means, and purpose of what is the trafficking in the human person. If it's done for the removal of an organ that can be bought and sold, it entails an exploitation, a victimization of an individual because of their social condition. In contrast, the trafficking in human organ by the Council of Europe Convention is defined now as a commercial transaction, and it holds culpable not just the brokering individual, but the donor and the recipient, or the vendor and the recipient, and any of those that are involved in that process. That Council of Europe Convention, we hope to be consequential in its implementation to the private hospitals in which they are doing this. It becomes illegal, and up to now, there's been no recourse to monitor what is happening in these private sector institutions. So permit me to make those kinds of introductory remarks. We're going to hear now from people who are quite credible in the experience of this organ trafficking. And I return it back to you now, Laura, as the moderator, thanking your enabling our making these introductory remarks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Monica, for those very important remarks. And now we're going to hear from Dr. Rudolf Garcia-Gallont. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I think Dr. Monica has touched some of the very specific points that lead into this. Talking, for example, for Latin America, of course, all countries do have a legislation that bans and penalizes organ commercialism, but again, poor law enforcement leaves especially the private hospitals out of this of the enforcement. It's not that it is that they are free to do whatever they want. They just do not report, and they don't owe an explanation to anybody. So the real sad thing about it is that it's normally the same professionals that work in the official public transplantation programs. They themselves become involved, a small circle of them, in participating in this illegal activities where foreign patients come into, since they are economically capable, they always go to a private hospital, and then they have a local donor pre-arranged by a broker, and that is where it all happens. Therefore, one of our efforts in Central America has been directed towards approaching these private hospitals. There is, for example, in Central America, the Federation of Private Hospitals that meets once a year. We have made presentations at their meetings and have them recruited to sign up with the principles of the Declaration of Istanbul, and even to publicize this in their websites and so on, as a mechanism that would keep brokers away from that hospital, and if they all pronounce themselves in the same sense. So this is one possible way to curtail this kind of practice. So that is one of the panoramas that we are watching. Yes, I give it back to you now. No.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to remind the audience that if you want to submit questions, you can do so through the chat window in the right-hand corner. We will be answering questions after all the presentations, but you may want to start submitting them, and then we will be selecting some of them or all of them. So our next speaker is going to address the issue from a more human rights perspective, more from practitioners in the field type of. Dr. Deborah Budiani-Severi, who's a medical anthropologist, is the executive director and founder of the Coalition for Organ Failure Solution, which is one of the main NGOs working in this area. She has conducted extensive field research on organ trade and follow-up studies with the COF team, and established prevention and outreach programs in various countries, including Egypt and India. She has provided consultation on organ and trade-related abuses to the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights of the United Nations and to the World Health Organization, as well as to the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime. She has also worked in alliance with various medical and civil society organizations in issues related to human trafficking and illicit organ trade. We are going to listen to her comments, and again, I want to remind you, if you have questions, you can submit them to us through the window, the chat window, sorry. Deborah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to our sponsors of this webinar, namely Babson College's Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, the George Mason University's program on, Office of Terrorism, Transnational Crime and Corruption Center, and the others that I saw on the slide just before we opened, and I was less aware of, but I think it's the Denison Group. So thank you to each of those sponsors, and thank you to the panelists who just spoke before me, friends and colleagues who have worked in alliance with COFS and myself directly for many years, and it's a pleasure to be here together. So we at the Coalition for Organ Failure Solutions, or COFS, the NGO I represent, have identified cases of persons trafficked for the removal of organs, primarily kidneys, since 1999. And are my slides coming up? If someone could start those. So COFS is a nonprofit international health and human rights organization with a mission to combat trafficking in persons for the removal of organs by conducting policy advocacy, research, awareness, raising, and most importantly, victim assistance services.
Okay, let me just tell her she's the presenter.
Okay.
Hi, Christina.
She can hear you.
Oh, hi, Deborah. If you're the presenter, so do you, you can just click on the top and your presentation is there. And I can help you move the slides if it's not working.
Wait, is it DICG one?
No.
This one?
Next one.
Okay.
I'm getting instructed here on how to get my slideshow to start. I'm sorry, I thought it came automatically. Can you tell me what to click, please? Yes, it's not good here. Okay, now I can.
No, she can hear you.
Okay, you just click on the arrows at the top and let me know.
I know from there. I just needed it to come up. Okay.
Of course, sure.
Okay. Okay, so I'm on? Yeah? Okay, presumably. So COFS, as I was saying, is a nonprofit international health and human rights organization with a mission to combat trafficking in persons for the removal of organs by conducting policy advocacy, research, awareness raising, and most importantly, victim assistance services. We've identified over 3,000 persons trafficked for the removal of organs and conducted in-depth longitudinal interviews and provided assistance to approximately 400 of them. As we continue to identify new cases on the ground, we have projects to continue to provide assistance to at least 250 victims per year for the next 3 years. We believe this is still just reaching the tip of the iceberg. So COFS starts with the premises that socioeconomic conditions should not be determinants for an organ donation, and that a human rights-based approach should be employed to assure that trafficking for the removal of organs, what I refer to as TPRO, is not reduced to a problem of supply and demand of organs for transplantation, of organized crime and criminal justice, or voiceless abandoned victims, but rather situates victims or survivors and the advocacy of their interests really at the center of our responses to this problem. And in this respect, in many ways, those of you with expertise in human trafficking might get the sense that we're still years behind the general movement of responses to trafficking in persons, such that we still must work for greater recognition of the victims and their rights. So in our grassroots level work, COFS has encountered victims such as Aishwarya. Based in the field, we consistently identify victims and discover the increasingly clever and abusive methods that traffickers develop for commercial organ removal. This slide captures the image of a particularly troubling case of Aishwarya, who resides in a very remote region of West Bengal, India. So just in brief, at the age of 22 years, Aishwarya was trafficked for, or exploited, we can say, for a kidney by her husband in the urban center of Kolkata. Shortly after he collected the funds from the sale of her kidney, he then abandoned Aishwarya with their 2 young sons, and she later learned that he married 2 other women, had children with them, trafficked them for kidney money, and shortly after also abandoned them. So I've used this story once or twice before, and I refer to it again because I think it's of special interest to experts in human trafficking, most especially because of the awareness of the landscape of trafficking in that part of the world, of trafficking of children, and the kind of strategies or incentives, plans that traffickers such as her husband may be strategically using. And it's especially troubling to us to think of what his intentions were to first have children with his wives, who he then trafficked for an organ, and what kind of concerns that brings up, and especially for and needs for protection for not only the victim of
the trafficking for removal of organs, but also her children. So Aishwarya does not have resources to acquire support for consequences that have resulted from her commercial kidney removal or to protect her sons from being trafficked as well. And so like with Aishwarya, most PR abuses occur when an organ is removed from a victim within a location where the recipient awaits and a transplant is performed. So while explicit threats or use of force or coercion for an organ removal are employed in some cases, clever traffickers do not use violence and force, but rather more manipulative methods to obtain an organ. The majority of cases thus involve implicit coercion measures and the variety of other means included in the definition, namely of the UN Trafficking Protocol, namely fraud, deception, or the giving of payments or benefits, and abuse of power or vulnerability for the removal of organs. And I think it's important to keep in mind that also consistent with the definition in the UN Trafficking Protocol, whether persons are abducted, recruited, solicited, or received, these cases are still very much arguably considered cases of trafficking. So as can be seen in or read in COFS's study on Sudanese in Egypt who were trafficked for the removal of organs, the asylum seekers were put into situations in which people smugglers who assisted them to cross the border later provide food and housing for them in Cairo and then demand exorbitant sums for this assistance. So smugglers collaborate with kidney traffickers to suggest the idea of a kidney sale as a way to remedy the financial problem. And also documented in other COFS reports of debt collectors in India, and then in this study that was published on victims of the organ trade in Egypt, and then you can see that the language has changed over time. As we may have in earlier years called them commercial living donors, and now with better recognition of the abuses of trafficking and rights abuses, we can more squarely refer to them as victims of the organ trade or persons trafficked for the removal of organs. But debt collectors, as we could see both in India and Egypt, suggested a kidney sale to settle a debt in most cases. And this also suggests that the indebted target could more easily be threatened with narratives from the traffickers of they would want to see their family remain safe. I mean, debt burdens become quite violent or aggressive in many circumstances. So traffickers of persons for the removal of organs do not explain risks and often do not complete or make the payment after the kidney removal. In India, the majority of commercial transplants come from donors who invariably agree to sell an organ due to the presence of a social determinant or vulnerability of some kind. Findings from COFS India field research revealed that many victims felt they had no option to sell a kidney because of either personal, situational, or circumstantial vulnerability. And those are important categories that have been laid out in the trafficking literature, most especially in that case by the UNODC. So for over a decade, COFS has worked to identify, assess, and address needs of persons trafficked for the removal of organs, including and most especially medical follow-up care, for which TTS has been an important partner, engage policymakers and other stakeholders of our findings to enhance legal frameworks and call for accountability. And here's just some images from our field work. We've worked also to enhance and share data on this issue by producing evidence-based victim-centered reports on our findings and by developing an online case report and resource tool that I'll briefly mention later. We've also worked to collaborate with transplant professionals like Frank and Rudolf and the others in the Declaration of Istanbul group towards gaining commitments against commercial organ donations and professional codes and practices, and we have sought to engage trafficking experts and human rights experts and gain their recognition of this form of human trafficking. So the trafficking protocol is extremely useful for us to advocate the interests of persons exploited for the removal of organs via state obligations to provide protection, assistance, and remedies, as well as prevention and prosecution measures. Important also are other relevant instruments, such as the Declaration of Basic Principles of Victims of Crime and Abuse of Power, and those broader categories also become extremely important to us, particularly in times that trafficking may be harder to prosecute. And hopefully that will become easier, and we're learning more about that with the legal aid that we're providing. So needs of persons trafficked for the removal of organs include protection and support, as not only enforceable rights of trafficked persons, but also the needs that persons trafficked for the removal of organs consistently express. So further, like with persons trafficked for sex or labor, protection and support must be, 1, granted without conditions based on victims' agreement to cooperate with law enforcement, and 2, must assure victims have access to these services. Like with persons trafficked for other purposes, identification of persons trafficked for the removal of organs can only be made when protection mechanisms are clearly established. So these should include privacy and protection from further harm. To ensure that trafficked persons are protected from their exploiters, there should be no public disclosure of identity of trafficking victims, and their privacy should be respected to the extent possible while taking into account the right of any accused person for a fair trial. So we at CFS have developed several measures to protect privacy of their identities, including a highly secured online reporting tool that we use for internal purposes now, pardon me, and as minimal entitlements, victims have the legal right to have their immediate physical safety ensured and to be protected by the state from further harm. And legal assistance and temporary residence permits should also be granted to victims. Excuse me. Victims should be given information and legal advice on the options available to them, including their rights and options as witnesses under the criminal justice system of the country in which they are currently located. So examples include residency permits. And a concept of special importance in this issue, is the final one listed on this slide, is that of non-punishment for being involved in crimes while being trafficked. That, and this principle has received more attention in counter-trafficking movement in recent years. This means that trafficked persons shall not be detained, charged, or prosecuted for the illegality of their entry into or residence in countries of transit and destination, or for their involvement in unlawful activities to the extent that such involvement is a direct consequence of their situation as trafficked persons. Trafficked persons should also not be charged or prosecuted for offenses they have committed in the course of their being trafficked. So just as smuggled migrants must be distinguished from trafficked persons, with a recognition that a smuggled migrant could become a trafficked person at any point in time in the process, persons trafficked for organ removal must also be distinguished from the category of organ sellers, quote unquote, of that category. This means that where laws exist that criminalize the organ seller, there must be a process of distinction in place to assess if trafficking has occurred. So just as in the cases of asylum seekers who fled Sudan in search of refuge in Egypt, but they relied on people smugglers or to enter Egypt and become then victims of kidney traffickers. So that having an assessment process in place is essential. And in terms of support, victims of trafficking have a legal entitlement to receive assistance commensurate with their status as victims of crime and victims of human rights violations. So states are under a corresponding obligation to provide such assistance. Placing conditions on the provisions of assistance denies the legal nature of both the entitlement and the obligation. So assistance services should include the following, and that I've listed on this slide. And while many of the needs are shared among victims of the various forms of trafficking, persons trafficked for the removal of organs need specific medical follow-up according to the organ removed. And while it's mostly cases of kidneys, there's increasingly been cases in recent years of partial liver removal. I think I'll not detail this right now and move on to discuss the challenges to meet victims' needs. And trafficking in persons for the removal of organs, or what I can call TPRO, is not yet sufficiently recognized as a form of human trafficking in, first and foremost, anti-trafficking initiatives or domestic anti-trafficking law. So, for example, the U.S. Trafficking Victims Protection Act does not include trafficking for the removal of organs. And thirdly, it's accordingly sufficient commitments to protection and support have not yet been made in cases. Another challenge is that in many countries, transplant professionals are not given adequate oversight within and from outside their institutions, points made by both Frank and Rudolf. So the Transplantation Society, or DICG more specifically, has worked diligently to set and improve standards of transplant practices and gain wide endorsements for the declaration. COFS has collaborated in this process and various points, and efforts are underway to require mandatory reporting of transplant professionals who deviate from these standards and engage in organ trade-related abuses. This is especially important as there are many professionals engaged in the ongoing abuses and are outside of the circuit or disregard the Transplantation Society circuit. So just to add to the comments that Frank and Rudolf made, that while the private sector is of key importance, we've seen that even public sector, public hospitals that just were not given any or adequate oversight were also hospitals where abuses occurred. So it was really just about the oversight first and foremost in these considerations. It has also become a normative practice in certain societies or hotspots where transplants have been characterized by commercialism, such as Egypt and India. So, for example, in Egypt, some religious clerics have guided doctors not to ask, or related organ donors are commonly paid. Doctors share a strong cultural discomfort with procuring organs from brain dead, and narratives that it is a fair exchange of people need dominate in some medical professional circles. So we've worked in some ways and wrote about some of the cultural considerations or institutional considerations that play on the very local level of local moral world. Another challenge is the lack of fulfillment of state obligations to identify, assist, and protect persons trafficked for the removal of organs. And finally, a real challenge has been, so like with the need for important data on other illicit crimes and other forms of human trafficking, data on this abuse must be improved, and states should support such initiatives. Like estimates of other forms of human trafficking, estimates of the numbers of cases of TPRO cases are vague, unreliable, and still too dependent upon shallow anecdotal information. We need rigor in our estimates and depth in our investigations to improve data and better inform our responses. And just very briefly, I will mention the online reporting tool that COFS has developed, again, just currently for internal purposes, but that we hope to launch possibly within the next year. In brief, COFS's online reporting and resource tool is called XDOT to Expose and Disrupt the Organ Trade, is designed to collect and share standardized case reports of persons trafficked for the removal of organs, transplant tourism, and other organ trade-related abuses in a carefully secured system. So XDOT map, let me show you as we can zoom in. In these screenshots, cases that COFS field staff have reported are mapped according to their location and organ removal, and we can see it drill down for India, of locations where the reported illicit organ removal occurred. And then we cross these with the in-depth studies we did and have done and continue to do in Egypt, which reveal that persons trafficked for the removal of organs were well below the poverty level of India, and one moment here. This slide explains also the reason for sale, as I explained that majority of cases were cases of death, and that this was a common force that drove individuals to resort to an organ sale. But in cases like West Bengal, we see that the debt was also caused by basic needs like food, and that there were sections of the victim population that were literally starving, or their families were starving, which is not terribly uncommon in that region of India especially. And our in-depth studies also reveal more information about the causes of death, to include, as we see here, marriage, family illness, being abandoned or widowed, children's education, family substance abuse, which is especially common in certain other regions like Tamil Nadu, and loss of job or lack of income. So I'll end now with recommendations very briefly. And these include that wider state and civil society recognition of this offense as an abuse of human trafficking and human rights be made, and in accordance, better responses to the offenders and for the victims of the crime. So initiatives that protect and assist persons trafficked for sex and labor, when appropriate, should be extended to persons trafficked for the removal of organs. State support should be granted for this extension. Also, better data investigations are needed, whether driven by states or civil society initiatives. Support for collecting better data and conducting investigations must be granted. Thirdly, cooperation and multi-agency approach. There should be further cooperation between the important various actors or players, interest groups in addressing this issue. And finally, further engagement of private sector involvement. We've discussed already a bit about private sector hospitals, but we can also be thinking of insurance companies at a minimum that they should not cover costs for a patient to travel abroad for transplant when information is not clear about the source of the organ. We can also be thinking about biotech companies and the potential role they may play, whether it be in providing artificial organs or perfusion machines, and having more responsibility or reporting obligations about the use of those perfusion machines, and if organs are traveling, or more information about the source of those organs that are being used in the perfusion machines. And I will end with that. Thank you so much for the time I was given, and I look forward to hearing questions from the participants and the other presentations by the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deborah. That was really, really interesting, and it provides a very in-depth view into what's really happening on the ground. Our next speaker will give us another very interesting perspective on this issue. We have heard from the transplant professionals, we have heard from civil society representatives, and now we're going to hear from Ms. Silke Albert, who has worked on human trafficking and related issues since 2001, both for intergovernmental and grassroots non-governmental organizations. She's currently crime prevention expert with the UNODC's Human Trafficking and Migrant Smuggling section, and she's responsible for all technical assistance delivered under the Trafficking in Persons Protocol. And she has been working and has been the lead author in the publication of a series and the development of a series of tools and documents that UNODC has issued recently, and in particular of the toolkit on human trafficking for the purpose of organ removal. But she will tell us more about it. Silke, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and also from me, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending where everybody is. To everybody, and also thanks for the opportunity to participate in this important webinar on an issue that is not new, that has existed for long, but that comes more and more to the forefront, and it is more and more reported about. This is the fate of the last speaker, so there is not much for me to say which has not been said already. That's the distinction of trafficking in persons and trafficking in persons for the purpose of organ removal, and trafficking in organs, then the reference to the non-punishment of victims of trafficking in persons for the purpose of organ removal being victims of a crime, and at the same time may possibly be liable for offences that have to do with the prohibition of financial gain dealing with the organs. And then also the issue of protection and assistance. And what I found very, very fascinating now was also with the last presentation, this data collection or online reporting tool, and also the data that you've shown that also confirms what we've been hearing, what we've been seeing, and the data that we have. Maybe I should briefly talk about the work my section is doing, and that is we indeed focus on trafficking in persons for the purpose of organ removal, and we support governments and in their efforts to implement that trafficking in persons protocol. To the audience, I guess you are from the private sector predominantly, so that may sound like one kind of boring UN thing, but it's something actually quite key for us, because it's a treaty that member states have negotiated, and so that means that it's the member states that do want to address the issues in a particular way, including now trafficking in persons for the purpose of organ removal. We heard already, but also very short, that trafficking in persons indeed is different from trafficking in persons for organ removal. Sorry, is different from trafficking in organs. And when we ask this question, or when we make the statement, then it sounds very, very obvious that yes, it's two different conduct, it's two different offenses, etc. But when we look a little bit closer, then we think, so what is the difference? And just for you who may not have daily to do with trafficking in persons and the way it is defined. So trafficking basically consists of an act of recruitment and transport, transfer, etc. of persons by specific means. For example, the use of force, the threat of force, but also deception and the abuse of a position of vulnerability for the purpose of exploitation. So the benefits of the traffickers come from the exploitation, and so our protocol also says that consent of a person to the conduct or to the form of exploitation is irrelevant where these means have been used. That means where a person was not able to give a valid consent because of the deception that has been used, because of the threat that has been used, or because of the physical force that has been applied. And also because of the position of vulnerability of a particular person. And when we then look at trafficking in organs, then we would naturally assume that in trafficking in organs, we do have a valid consent, and in trafficking in organs, it's really only the organ that is trafficked. And that's exactly, that is a real, it's a practical difficulty, and it does have an impact on the persons affected, how we look at that. And I don't think it's as simple from what we've seen to really say somebody who goes and offers an organ actively could not be a victim of trafficking in persons. And there we come to an issue that is very relevant in all trafficking in persons cases, and certainly also in trafficking in persons for organ removal, and that's the issue of consent. And in the case of trafficking in persons for organ removal, the requirements or the standards for the consent must be very high, because consent is already required, and the standard for a consent for a medical intervention is already very high. So also these kind of standards would need to be kept and would need to be fulfilled. And then we see and hear of cases that have been mentioned also here already, that people who give their consent, they may consent to something they don't fully understand. They may give consent or they may offer their organ. It's predominantly kidneys, as we understand. They may offer without knowing what they get into, without knowing the health consequences, without knowing that there are aftercare needs, without knowing the risks. Maybe signing documents in a language that they can't understand, maybe even being told lies from what we heard from our experts that we consulted, like, well, you anyway have 2 kidneys and you only need 1, so this one is just a spare one, that once a kidney is removed, it can grow again in your body, and all sorts of explanations and wrong information. So that for us, we have to be really, really careful to think about what we call trafficking in persons for organ removal and what we call organ trafficking. So it's not just about some UN jargon and some language that we like in our treaties, but it really has consequences. And yes, also we came across the lack of data. And I can provide you with some information that we have from our global report. So UNODC is mandated to report on trafficking in persons globally by the General Assembly, and that means we collect mainly official data that we get from member states on trafficking in persons, and already there the data is very rare. So we have information on the legislation of a country, etc. But we actually have very little information and very little data on the prosecutions and the convictions of traffickers. So that's on trafficking in persons in general, be it for sexual exploitation, for labor exploitation, and other forms of exploitation. So the same is true, and the more so for trafficking in persons for organ removal, for various reasons that have been mentioned already, and also seemingly criminal justice seems to be hesitant to look into cases that involve, as potential offenders, a highly regarded profession, which is medical doctors and highly specialized surgeons. So this is but this is only one of the reasons, and other reasons that criminal justice, they may just not be adequately equipped to really look into cases, to really study the crime scene, to look for indicators for trafficking in persons for organ removal, and to even cooperate with people from the health sector that could actually support information, that could provide evidence or at least hints and documentation of possible cases going on. So this is something that definitely would need to be addressed more. So from the cases, from the data that UNODC has, it shows that between 2007 and 2013, 100 cases of trafficking in persons for the purpose of organ removal were detected by the national criminal justice systems and reported to UNODC by 20 countries in all regions of the world. So if you look at 100 cases, it can be assumed that really we just see, as in other trafficking in persons cases, we just see the tip of the iceberg. And also having this lack of data and lack of information, which is more and more discussed also at the General Assembly and at other bodies of the UN, more and more resolutions in this regard are adopted, and so it gets more international attention, and also in this regard, this enables UNODC to also collect data on trafficking in persons for organ removal for the global report. The last one came out in 2014. The next one will come out in 2016. And also what my organization has done is to develop an assessment handbook, trying to develop tools that would allow an assessment of, for example, loopholes in a legislative framework of a country or in systems of a country, or assess also loopholes and or gaps, assess gaps in the criminal justice response. And also we have a couple of questionnaires in our assessment toolkit that could help identify actual cases, that could help, for example, criminal justice practitioners, but maybe also people from the private sectors and also from the health sector to identify possible cases, because it's a real problem, the identification of cases, and with that the identification of victims, and with that if victims of trafficking in persons are not identified as victims of trafficking or of a crime in general, that means that they would not have access normally to the protection and assistance mechanism that have been mentioned before. So UNODC also developed this handbook, and what I mean it has a couple of recommendations in various fields, and maybe what I should do is I focus on our core mandate, which is related to the criminal justice area, and to say that among the challenges that our experts and the experts that we consulted to develop that tool, and if I'm not completely wrong, I think we even tried with Deborah, but you were not available. Anyway, the experts that we consulted, they were from different groups, from the medical or different professions, from the medical area, from the academic area, from non-governmental organizations, and also from the government, from the intergovernmental international organizations like my own, and then of course from the criminal justice. And together they have said that what is a real challenge for criminal justice is, or for the investigation and prosecution of cases, is that very often the net of the things that are happening is very complex. So there would be a donor from one country, a broker maybe from a different country, the operation taking place in another country, with a recipient that is yet from another country. And these things, they happen, and they happen in different countries, and it's the challenge to bring all of that together and to make the criminal justice from these different countries to work together and to help each other and to cooperate with each other, and so that is in a way that what we see, this is a real ideal setting. This is an ideal setting for the criminals. And then also, again, which has been mentioned, that the crime may take place within legitimate sectors and with the involvement of legitimate sectors, and also that we heard it's not just the medical sector, it can be insurances, health insurances, it can be the travel agencies, etc. So even like people mentioned that it's even transport businesses. Then, of course, as in other trafficking in persons cases, victims are often reluctant to contact the authorities out of fear of the traffickers, out of fear of retaliations against themselves and their families. They may also fear, as it has been mentioned before, they may fear their own prosecution, and they may also even lack the awareness about their rights and about possible complaint mechanisms and any resources available that could help identify them as victims of trafficking. Red flags were also identified by our experts, red flags for investigators and basically investigators who look at cases and For example, a big red flag is the lack of documentation of the donor consent. In fact, our experts have said across the board, if you compare the documentation and the files for a properly done organ transplantation with the files of transplantation that includes this commercial transaction, which is normally prohibited, so it would be done a bit underground. If you see the documentation, it's a striking difference, and already from that you could see. And then, so the lack of documentation of donor consent, the lack of consent form signed by organ donors for any given organ donation, as well as a lack of social reports and psychological reports on the donor. Then also foreign names of donors, at least there you would have to then look at the relationship between the donor and the recipient. Then there were reported cases where somebody boarded a plane with a kidney removal scars that was not older than 48 hours or less. So that was very alerting. Then actually we were also told that immigration authorities, for example, they see a lot of like invitation letters to particular hospitals or from a particular hospital, and then also sometimes people that are interrogated at the airport would not really, they would claim they come for a medical checkup, but would then not have any further details on what that is. It's just, I'm not saying that all of that must automatically comprise trafficking in persons for organ removal, but these and others, I think I have to come to an end, these and others were identified as red flags, and then also the experts, of course, came up with suggestions what criminal justice could do in particular. I guess I better end because it's almost half an hour before the end of the webinar, and we want to give the audience, of course, an opportunity to come in with questions and to discuss. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Silke, very much. Before we open the floor for questions, and I want to remind the audience to please send your questions through the chat window. We are very fortunate to have among us Dr. Campbell Fraser, who's Senior Lecturer at the Griffith University Business School in Australia, and he's very knowledgeable about these issues. And we would like to ask him to make a few remarks on these topics on which he has a lot of experience.
Thank you very much.
Campbell, are you there?
Thank you. Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yes, you can hear me now? Good. Right, I don't know if you can see me. Hello from Australia. It's 1:30 in the morning here. Good to be with you. I'm faculty of a business school, an international business school, so I'm interested in it from the international business perspective, but more importantly than that, I'm actually a kidney transplant recipient myself. So I received a legal transplant in Australia, but I met many other patients who were traveling overseas for transplantation through the organ market, hence I became interested in it. And I'm very interested in the progress that has been made. I certainly know that the DICG has made some wonderful progress in eradicating a lot of organ trafficking that goes on, but there's still a lot of threats out there, and maybe some threats that we haven't given full consideration to. That it's probably the changing of the paradigm of organ trafficking. The first one that I'm seeing is that a lot of people who are in need of a kidney, a lot of the kidney buyers, are actually sourcing their own donors online. So there are a number of people in China, in Vietnam, in India, who are actually advertising they would like to sell a kidney, and the buyers are then making direct contact with them, agreeing a price, and then they're being trafficked individually by the buyer to a third country for that transplantation. And this is happening a lot in Sri Lanka, for example. So in Sri Lanka, we have moved well away from using Sri Lankan donors, or Sri Lankan vendors, which was a big problem. But now Sri Lanka is a center for people bringing their own donors, and a number of cases that I'm seeing of this, and it's a shift away. So it's actually taking the broker out of the equation, and the buyers themselves are brokering the deal directly. And a lot of that is because we have Facebook, we have the internet, social media, and it's now possible for the first time for them to actually contact directly with people who want to sell. Another issue that I'm seeing a lot of is that we generally have the idea that organ trafficking is about a rich buyer from the United States, Canada, Western Europe, going to the poorer country. But what I'm seeing a lot of is in countries where there is no deceased donation system, or not really a robust donation system, is where, particularly in Asia, where there is a growing middle class of fairly affluent people, when they are in need of an organ, they're buying within country from somebody of their own nationality who's of a lower, in the poorer group. So this is happening in China, for example. Whereas before in China, it was foreigners who were going to receive the transplant. It's actually a new emerging middle class in China. It's the Chinese patients themselves who are buying the organs. So not nearly as many foreigners going in, but a lot of domestic transplantation. The same problem is happening in the Philippines. Now, the Philippines used to be a major center of international trafficking, particularly from the Middle East into the Philippines. There's been some wonderful work done in the Philippines, particularly by Dr. Domenico and his group. But what is still happening in the Philippines is that wealthy Filipinos are buying the kidneys of poorer Filipinos. So the answer to that is we really have to work hard to develop deceased donation systems in these countries, because there's really no other option for people who are requiring an organ in these countries but to receive a live organ. So there's total reliance on live organ donation. Now, some of these patients, of course, will get an organ from relatives, from family, but a lot of them, and in some cases, I think probably more than half the transplants that are being done are actually being done by commercial donors within the country themselves. So this is a lot more difficult to trace because it's not as if it's an American patient who's going to China and coming back and then having to present at their home transplant center for the follow-up care, and there's a lot of follow-up care that's required, particularly in the first few months after transplantation. So we don't really see how many people are actually having these transplants done. So it's very difficult to measure, and the only way I'm able to do that is as a kidney patient myself, I'm able to access other patients, and patients talk to patients, so I can join patient-to-patient support groups, and I find out where these patients are actually buying the organs from. So in terms of, I know we've got very little time, but you'll probably want, well, what's the solution? Well, I think business schools have to get really involved in this and look at where can the private sector actually get involved in the development of deceased donation systems in these countries. Because if we have a deceased donation system, it will change the culture of donation. Because in a lot of these countries, the culture of donation it's about live donation. Whereas in the US, in Australia, here in Western Europe, the culture of donation is primarily, the first thing we think is deceased donation and then live donation. So we have to have some involvement with private hospitals, with NGOs, other private organizations and to work with governments. Some of those governments are probably do not have the transparency to be able to do it themselves. So hence the private sector maybe has a role to play there to develop and encourage a deceased donation system. And as an example of that, on Sunday I go to Vietnam to to work there with the development of the Vietnamese Transplantation Society. It's the first time a transplant society has been formed. So I'm part of a group that's part of Dr. DeMonico's group, and we're going there to give some talks there, and hopefully that will really ignite the idea of deceased donation in Vietnam. So that's the sort of work that I'm doing. I know I'm probably gone way over time. I was told I just had a quick slot, but I'm very happy to answer any questions from any other members of the panel or indeed the audience. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Campbell. We are now going to address some questions from the audience. We have two very interesting questions. I encourage you to send us more. The first question is from Jessica Panikoff, and it's very, very relevant. And Jessica asks, what can the financial sector do to combat this? What are the specific indicators that the financial sector can look at? Names of specific individuals, cities, banks that could be complicit in this. It's really important for people working in some industries like banking or finance to know what to look for example, when they do screening of financial transactions and wired activity. So any of our panelists would like to take this question?
Laura,
Deborah?
Yes, just a thought about this is that in the XDOT online reporting tool that I mentioned, we had consulted experts in financial crime such that we gathered the kind of questions we could ask in the questionnaire for potential informants that could be useful then for certain authorities to investigate financial transactions. So we were advised about which modes of transferring funds would potentially be used that could be, and of course those could be traced by certain authorities. So we were trying to really get at that too, so that when we launch it for other informants who may know that kind of information, as well as transplant tourists themselves or representatives of transplant tourists about how money was transferred, that could receive further attention from investigators. So this is just one of the ways that we were also trying to get at financial information in response to the question.
Okay, thank you very much. That's really interesting. Sylvie, do you want? Yes, Campbell?
Sorry,
yes.
It's just sometimes, particularly in China, the transactions are conducted in cash. So I have literally a cache full of maybe $50,000 US. So that's a little bit difficult to trace. So maybe the currency coming into the country, cash, is maybe something that customs authorities can look at, but sometimes it is simply cash.
Right, that's the problem with this type of transactions. Sometimes they're small scale, so they're very hard to trace. We have another question that's very interesting, and it's related from Jonathan Arnold, and his question is: to what extent is the internet used in organ trafficking such that it creates a digital footprint that can be used for detection and disruption? This is a really relevant question because the internet and social media, I think, have such an important and multifaceted role in this type of activities. And I think, Campbell, perhaps you can add to that. And I think also Dr. Garcia-Gallont could say something about that too. Go ahead, Campbell.
Yes, well, certainly in the Philippines, it's Facebook. If you want to buy a kidney in the Philippines, there'll be Facebook groups that there'll be people who will have had a transplant who will know other people who will want to sell. And in the Philippines, particularly in the south, in Mindanao, there's whole villages of people who have sold kidneys, and they get together on Facebook, and so the one person who has sold can then pass that information to somebody else who's interested in selling. So that's primarily how it's done there. Whereas in China, it's more word of mouth directly between patients. But certainly in terms of being done on the internet, yeah, the Philippines, it's pretty much the main way the transactions are conducted.
Thank you very much. Anyone else would like to comment on that?
I'd be happy to.
What I could say is, okay.
Okay.
Go ahead, Frank.
Well, perhaps let's have Deborah make her comment, but then I would suggest that Rudolf and I can make some comments as well. So please, Deborah, after you.
Thank you. Deborah?
Well, as Frank and others have seen me present at meetings, we at FieldVest had an initiative to really try to trace the transactions on Facebook between those seeking and those offering to buy and sell an organ. And there were cases where where it looked like a success as much as the connection between the buyer and seller was a success as much as was revealed in their transaction. So we documented these and wrote a letter to Facebook, and it was difficult to engage them. Of course, we're happy to have constructive dialogue about that again, and recommendations to them and other major internet players such as Google are some of the real ways that they can address this with algorithm to catch this. And Google's done a fantastic job of committing to efforts against illicit trade and human trafficking, and it'd be really wonderful to also get their and other major internet players further commitments in these kind of ways to address these transactions that are very apparent on some of the websites that are being used.
Thank you, Deborah. Dr. DeMonico?
Well, let me ask Rudolf, and then I'd like to make some further comment. But Rudolf, please, after you.
Can I have my slides just to go to some of the aspects?
Yes, sure.
Please. So, because Campbell just mentioned that the only way to counter this is to increase disease donation, but now look at what all this organ traffic does to the legitimate programs and the ethical programs that these countries are trying to develop. Can you advance the slide? It's just a couple of slides. So again, this has been talked about, but look at here. This is Colombia, for example. Back in 2005, 16% of the organs were going to foreigners. This is the classical model, Campbell. This is the classical model, of course. It's different from this internal market to which we will come in a while. But look how on the right side here, the family refusals were up to 50% people at the same time when this was happening. This is 2005, the yellow bar. They were reluctant to give the organs of their loved ones in a program of disease donation. Look how the donation going to foreigners went down to 1% in 2010, and the trust gained back in the system brought family refusal down to 25%. Can I have the next one? Can I have the next? Oh, yes, please. And look here on the contrary. This is Peru in one of these classical three-country link that has already been mentioned. A donor from Peru, broker in Israel, brought into a transplant center in Ukraine, and with formal contracts between this brokering companies and the government. So this is interesting. Look, when this scandal came out, look how family refusal went up to 80%. This is distrust in the system. So they undermine, they truly undermine. Next slide, please. Look here, this is Mexico. This is Mexico. You can, through the internet, you can sign up to become a lung recipient, a kidney, pancreas, or a liver recipient for $130,000, and the response of the population is a per million donor incidence of 3.6 only, as compared to 35 in Spain, or around the 20s in many other countries. And this, you mentioned China and the Philippines as being one of the countries where this internal market of rich patients inside of the country buying from vendors or deriving organs from the waiting list. They buy themselves a preferred position in the waiting list, and they bypass all of the waiting stations. Mexico is a classical of one of these countries. So the next one, please. Costa Rica. There was also this triangulation, and look at here in the picture down here. You can see the doctors being seized in the hospital by the police when this was brought up, when this scandal was blown up. So what was the result? The society asked the legislators to switch back from the presumed consent that they have been having for almost 15 years to an opting-in method of becoming a donor. So this is practical examples. Next one, please. Next one, please. And this, for example, this is Germany. This is this journalist that made it public that he had got connected with a donor in Africa. This must have been on a private basis, as you say, Campbell, through the internet or whatsoever. They moved to Mexico, and now he gets back to Germany unaware that at this same moment the Council of Europe has already signed this convention that illegal acquisition of organs will be prosecuted in every member country, regardless if they were committed in a third non-regulated country. So there are certain ways to track it down and to keep it, to get control over it. But of course, the internet and the cash payments, they are big hurdles to it. Yes, thank you.
So if I may, Laura, just make some remarks right here just momentarily. I think where we've taken us, that is the important response to Campbell and to Silke, for example, and Deborah as well. The Council of Europe Convention gives us a new framework of making prosecution that we've not had up until now. And that prosecution is the de facto transaction, whereas in the past, with the trafficking of the human person for the removal of the organ, that required a proof of exploitation and victimization and abuse and fraud and coercion, etc. These Facebook internet interactions are no longer done in the midst of a coercion. Someone is online wishing to sell their kidney. And it will only be, in my view, by the Council of Europe framework that we can have an address of this in a more prosecutorial way, and that we have not had that capacity up till now. And therefore, even within a country such as the Philippines, if it signs on to the convention, or China, and at the moment the WHO has just been negotiating, trying to get China to sign on, or Russia, or any of these locations in which Campbell says it's the middle class that now is becoming the seller to the lower class. It is this opportunity of the buyer, no, it's the middle class that's selling to the lower class. It's the middle class or the richer that's selling to the lower class, the lowest class within the country. He expressed himself in saying that it wasn't the high rollers from foreign countries, but even the people in the middle class may be selling to the lower. But the point being, there's a disparity in the social status. And within a country, it's not the foreign patients coming into the country. It's not the Saudis and the Japanese and the United States and the Canadians that were regularly, and the Israelis, regularly going to the Philippines. It's the Council of Europe Convention that will enable us to have a redress of this activity within the country itself. And I think that's the most recent development that gives us some hope, because we completely agree with Campbell that the work is far from done. It's just transitioned to a different kind of practice than what we were experiencing 5 to 8 years ago. So thank you that we could make those comments. Back to you, Laura.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. We have another question before we end. Actually, we will have time for all the panelists to make some closing remarks, but I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. This is another very interesting question from Valerie Fairby, and she asks, is it possible to track incidents of trafficking for removal of organs in the news by using some specific keywords? In other words, are there some specific code words that we should look into in news reports that may give us better data about what's happening, other than the obvious keywords like organ trafficking or organ trade? Who would like to take that question? Deborah or Frank?
So, Deborah, after you. Oh, as always, after you, please, if I may ask your comment.
Well, just very briefly, yes, there's ways that you can capture headlines that deal with this that are quite simple from the use of something like Google Alerts and other similar tools. And then I'd be happy to further engage some of the discussion that's going on when you advise to do so, Laura.
Frank, do you want to address the same question?
I think in the interest of our time, there are key signal words that can be placed in that setting, and Campbell will know these as well. But
well, do you want me to go ahead?
Sure. Well, Laura's our chair. Laura, may you make some comment?
Yes, but did you finish your point?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say there are, but then Campbell wants to jump in and give some example of that. So, okay, Laura, I turn it back to you to enable him to do so.
Right, okay. In the Philippines, for example, in the Philippines, where we have people who, in that emerging middle class, who want to buy an organ from the poor, they are actually using crowdfunding to raise the money so they can buy the kidney. I've actually seen, so you can actually look at some of the crowdfunding websites, and if you look in, they have actually seen people trying to raise money, and even the local media has been supportive of the person who's said this person is what needs to raise $30,000, $50,000 in order to have a kidney transplant. And what they're really doing is saying is so that they can pay somebody else to have that kidneys. You can actually this crowdfunding to raise the money is supported by the local media. So it's the culture of it as well that's interesting there.
Very interesting. Okay, we're reaching the end of our 2-hour period. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give us some closing remarks for about 2 minutes each. Can we start perhaps with you, Frank, please?
Actually, Silke has to leave. I'm thinking if she's still on, Laura, sorry to jump in, if we could start with Silke.
Okay, thank you very much. That has been an interesting discussion also for me, and also very interesting to hear the different perspectives. In a way, I would still argue, as I said, that the mere fact that somebody offers an organ would not necessarily point towards the organ trafficking or point away from trafficking in persons for organ removal. But I certainly agree that, of course, trafficking in persons for organ removal, to prove the circumstances and to provide the necessary documentation and evidence, that is a challenge, and it remains a challenge, and it remains a challenge for trafficking in persons in general. But thanks again for the invitation, and thanks again to everybody for the interesting presentations, and I hope to stay in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Silke. Frank, do you want to say some closing remarks?
What I would like to ask is that you ask Rudolf and Deborah to make their remarks, and Campbell, and then perhaps I can make some concluding remarks from there. Thank you, Laura.
Okay, thank you so much. Rudolf, please.
Yeah, you can just speak. Just speak. Well, I think this has been a very enriching discussion. To some of us, it brought new aspects into what, especially the media, are adding to this scenario. A lot of it is not traceable. There is even WhatsApp or any other means by which they get in touch, and cash makes any other evidence disappear. We know, and this is a good remark that Campbell made, that the typical model of the foreigner, the rich foreigner traveling to a third world country, is not the typical scenario anymore. The market inside of the countries with social differences has taken care to change that profile, and that is very, very important, and we are seeing this in our countries. And the third one that I want to underline is where we all started. The private hospitals are the main actors in this kinds of activities, and it is towards them we have tried to recruit them and to have maybe some of the hospitals directors don't even know that they are doing wrong. They just have the doctor bring the donor and the recipient in as any other surgery, and they don't even look after what is behind. So we have to educate the private hospitals too. That's my point of view.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Deborah, do you have any closing remarks?
Yes, thank you. And thank you to my colleagues. So again, I just want to pick up what Silke just said, and pardon me, in response to Frank's comments. Whether a person is identified online via Facebook or not is not relevant for a case to be considered trafficking and a rights abuse. And it's not just a proof of coercion, but also a victim can be received and instead of just recruited or solicited. They can just be received and play upon their vulnerability. And this is further made clear prior to the UN Trafficking Protocol in the Declaration of Basic Principles of Justice for Victims of Crime and Abuse of Power. So those words are really important. And that was made in 1985. Also, the UN Trafficking Protocol, in fact, obliges states to hold all players who have been accountable in a crime, and it's signed and ratified by over 156 countries. So I just think it's important to recognize the full potential and power of the UN Trafficking Protocol and look for ways that it could be complementary, but to really recognize how powerful that is. And it's also important to recognize that most all of the world already prohibits payment for human organs, so that's a really key, other important piece. Finally,
Thank you, Deborah.
Another word about, okay.
No, go ahead, sorry.
Okay. No, thank you. Just to say that we also have seen a great number, maybe even we could say majority of cases that would involve domestic trafficking, and that's very important to continually keep in mind. And finally, I just really want to thank Silke, others at UNODC for creating the toolkit, also the UN Voluntary Trust Fund for investing in victim support for persons trafficked for the organ removal. This has been a real game changer and recognition and commitment in that recognition. And also a thanks to OHCHR to their interest and commitments to further address this issue, I think has been really important to our progress in this issue. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Deborah. Campbell?
Well, I'd like to end on a positive note. We have come a tremendous way since, say, 2008. We have made huge progress. There still does remain a lot of work to be done, but we are getting there. We need more people. We need people with money. We need business to get involved. There's only a few of us who are actually involved in this. So we need more people. We need businesses to engage with it. And this is a war we can win. We've come a long way. Yeah.
So thank you. Laura, may I make these remarks at this point?
Yes,
I know
please.
we have just a few minutes. This is a global issue. It's a human rights global issue. And I should say that, as Campbell has mentioned, since 2008, that's, of course, the date of the Declaration of Istanbul. And in Costa Rica and in Peru, the issues that Rudolf brought to attention, it was the Declaration of Istanbul group that was influential in making the changes that occurred in those specific instances. We were there to detect what was going on, and we need help to be able to do that. So yes, we need benefactors who are concerned about these human rights issues to enable an organization of energy to tackle this problem. I would wish to say that where we wish to target our efforts is governments and ministries of health, to have an oversight, a regulatory authority of all hospitals that provide transplantation services and not just the public sector. We will not be able to reckon with the problem unless ministries take that responsibility, that accountability of the practice of transplantation within the country. I do also think that the Council of Europe Convention will be an asset for us, because in those instances that this is being done by Facebook and internet interaction, where there is no coercion for somebody to be on the internet, and I recognize, of course, there's a social disparity that is by nature an exploitation, but it becomes very difficult to prosecute. And I also recognize that Deborah's point, well, this is a powerful aspect that already exists, but it's not been prosecuted. Those that would be making that effort have been reluctant to do so, fearing that they don't have the legislative tools to do so. So the Council of Europe is going to be helpful in that regard. It's a global problem. We need global help in resolving it. And I thank the organizers of this conference that might make the exposure of the problem that will enable those of us, the Campbells, the Deborahs, the Rudolphs, to have support for the effort of combating these unethical and now illegal practices. So thank you, Laura. Thank you to Christina and Babson and the grant that was provided to enable this discussion.
Thank you so much. Very, very, very important final point. Christina?
Perfect.
Christina, do you want to
Thank you so much, and thank you, Laura, for moderating an extraordinary conversation, and thank you to all of our speakers for joining us today. I am so thrilled to be doing this online conference with you after a few years and many conversations of how to do this, and I'm thrilled that we can feature this topic. So with that, I want to conclude our webinar series for the academic year. Thank you to so many of you. I see some familiar names on the attendee list who've been on every webinar. So thank you for sticking with us for multiple two-hour discussions. And again, we do hope that we will continue this. And please email me with feedback. Here's my email address up here, Christina Bain, cbain@babson.edu. We want to hear your thoughts about how you thought the webinar series has gone, what you'd like to see in the future, and any other questions that we weren't able to get to today. So thank you so much, and thank you to my colleagues at the Global Initiative and TRAC for participating with us, and of course our supporters, McKenna Long and Alder, soon to be Denton's US. Thank you and have a wonderful day, evening, and afternoon. Take care. Bye-bye.